Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back to today's lesson. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe. We are busy looking at economic indicators, and we are going to continue after looking at the PPI and the CPI. Moving right along, we are going to now look at the foreign trade indicators. So these are international trade, or these are part of international trade. And because we know that international trade is important in a globalized world, because we have moved away from being self-sufficient and now we do rely on other countries for certain resources. So exports stimulate employment and imports widen the choice of consumers. Okay, so when we export, then we create more employment opportunities. When we import, we widen the choice because that choice is important, and we're trying to move away from a monopoly where you've got just one company providing a product and they hike up the prices and consumers don't have much of a choice in that situation. Okay, and then moving on to the terms of trade. So what is the terms of trade? So it is the ratio of export and import prices. Because if you export and you import, there'll be certain prices that are used in that particular process. But here we have a ratio that we use in terms of export and import. So if the ratio deteriorates or gets worse, a greater volume of exports must be produced that may cause a spillover effect into the balance of payments. Remember, on our previous lesson, we mentioned the word or this term of a spillover. So when we looked at development, when we said that when government develops a particular area, they are doing it in a way that there's actually a spillover, that the development actually filters through to the neighboring areas as well. So also in this particular instance, when we have an increase in the volume of exports in our country, we are hoping for a spillover effect to actually happen so that it can even out the balance of payments at the end of the day. So it's important that we look at the relationship of export and import prices in terms of trade and also the agreements that are involved there. Then moving on, we look at the exchange rate now. So this is the value of one country's currency in relation to another country's currency. So we use a rand in South Africa, and in America they use a US dollar. In Botswana they use a pula. And in Europe, in some of the countries in Europe, they use a euro. In Britain, they use the British pound. So we look at the value of one country's currency in relation to another country's currency. So we benchmark the rand against the US dollar and against the pound and so on. And then now moving on to the employment indicators. So what are employment indicators? So the economically active population, we did come across this concept in our definitions that we looked at the beginning of this lesson. So now we are actually coming across the actual discussion around the economically active population, also known as the EAP. So we know that it is the labor force between 15 to 65 years of age. So these are people that actually sell their skills to the firms or to the business in order to generate an income or some form of remuneration, and we call them the economically active population. And then employment is another factor that we need to consider. So the number of employed persons as a percentage of the economically active population, for example, 73.5% in South Africa. Okay, that does help us because then if we're working out the unemployment in our country, that will indicate the actual or the health of our economy. So if we have a high level of unemployment, it shows that we do not have a healthy economy, because we should be in a position where we create jobs for people who want or who are looking for work. So that would help us to determine the well-being of our economy. So it's important that we look at the employment and also look at those that are economically active in the employment sector. And then also now here, so over here we're focusing on employment, and now we are going to focus on unemployment, like I've just said now. So the unemployed who are actively looking for work. So remember, these are the people that actually are looking for work as a percentage of the economically active population. So we need to look at that. So we know that currently our unemployment rate is sitting at plus or minus 26% at the moment, and it's considered to be high, because we should be in a position where we below 15%, and that's the 2020 target that the government has, that in 2020 we would have reduced our unemployment rate to 15% or below, and they do have policies in place in order to ensure that actually happens. Then we move on to productivity indicators. We know that the labor productivity is watched very closely, particularly in relation to real wage increases. So it's important that we look at this labor productivity, because when we look at wage increases, this would be considered. And hence we know that this is one area that is watched very closely. So labor productivity, so this is measured by dividing the real GDP by the number of workers employed. So we take our GDP and then we divide it by the number of workers that are actually employed. Okay, so we're not including the people. That are looking for jobs. We are talking about people who are actually employed. Okay, so just make sure that you don't include those that are seeking jobs, as per our discussion on the previous point. Remember, we looked at those that are employed and then also those that are unemployed but are actively looking for employment. So this is the statistic that we are going to use in that calculation. So that's how we actually work it out. So we take our GDP and we divide it by the number of workers employed. And then now the remuneration of workers is another point that we need to consider. So the remuneration per worker, so that is the compensation or the reward that the worker will get for their labor or for the labor that they've contributed. So the remuneration per worker, so if productivity increases or are lower, or if the productivity increases are lower than the real wages or than the real wage increases, so then we have the inflation pressures that will incur, because those do not coordinate, and hence they will result in inflation or inflationary pressures coming up in the system. So that would be for the remuneration per worker. So production mustn't be lower than the real wage increase, because then it creates that inflationary pressure to happen. And hence when HR designs packages for workers, they consider the inflation or the current inflation rate, so that the worker is in a position to live comfortably and also be in a position to purchase goods and services that they need. Then we move on to interest rates. So interest is the charge made for borrowing money. So we know that if you approach one of the financial institutions, you take out a loan, you have to pay back a monthly installment and in that monthly installment there will be an additional amount included in that, and that amount is known as interest. So that's the charge that you are paying for borrowing money from a financial institution. And then we also have what we call a repo rate. A repo rate is one of the most important interest rate indicators. It is the rate at which the South African Reserve Bank lends money to banks. Okay, so banks approach the South African Reserve Bank if they are wanting to take out a loan, and then the Reserve Bank will charge them what we call a repo rate. So that's the interest that the banks pay to the Reserve Bank when taking out a loan. So if we as households want to take out a loan, we are not going to approach the South African Reserve Bank for that, but we are going to go to our main financial banks that we have, which I'm not going to name. You know them. So you will go to one of them and then go through the whole application process. But when you pay back the money, you will pay it back with what we call interest. So the banks will charge you an interest based on the current interest rate, or sometimes it's based on your credit profile as a household. And then that will determine the interest rate that you are going to pay on that loan amount. Now we move on to another interesting topic, which is the money supply, because the supply of money is also very important. So the supply of money is controlled by the South African Reserve Bank. And people often say, you know, the government will say, we don't have the budget for this infrastructure. And then people will say, but, you know, surely they can print more money so that they can complete that project that they are wanting to do. That's not always the case, you know, because if they do that, then there'll be too much money in circulation, and then that will create a very high inflation rate. Our money will become worthless. And we've seen in a country like Zimbabwe, when there was so much money floating in the economy that the currency lost its value, and you'll be walking around with 1 million Zim dollars, and that's not even really worth that much. So you can't just say print money. That is not the solution, because of money that is in circulation must be controlled. And hence we have a structure like the South African Reserve Bank, which will ensure that money is controlled and that our currency does not lose its value. So the money is classified in 3 categories. So we need to know those. The first one being the M1. So these are the notes and coins in circulation and demanded deposits, or demand deposits of domestic private sector, or of the domestic private sector at banks. So we're looking at notes and the coins that are in circulation and demand deposits of the domestic private sector that are sitting at the banks. Okay, so we refer that as to M1. So when we talk about M1 in economics, we are referring to the notes and the coins that are in circulation. Then we have M2 over here. So here we have M1 plus other short-term and medium-term deposits of the domestic private sector at banks. Okay, so it is the notes and the coins, but in addition, you have the short-term and the medium-term deposits that are sitting at the banks. Okay, and then with M3 over here, so I'm going to go to M3 now. So with M3 over here, pull my screen down, there we are. So we're looking at M3 now. So it is M2 plus long-term deposits of domestic private sector, or of the domestic private sector at banks. Okay, so it is M2, so that plus the long-term deposits that are sitting at the domestic private sector at banks. Okay, so those are the different classifications of money. So money is classified accordingly, or according to M1, M2, and also M3. Okay, so it's important that we know this. We looked at this earlier on when we were looking at the secular flow, and also looking at the role of the Central Reserve Bank as well. Okay, moving right along. So we are going to carry on. So now I want to bring in social indicators. So let me just wrap up the economic indicators because they are very important when we are trying to establish the well-being of an economy. We have to consider those indicators because if we study them and if we analyze them, they will be able to give us a trend or a pattern in our economy, and then we can use that in order to make informed economic decisions. So it's very important that we consider this information, but we have to make sure that the information is valid and that is reliable as well and can be used in the process of making sound economic decisions. So it's important that we consider those different economic indicators. Now it's time to move to social indicators because we know that there are certain social elements that will give us an indication in terms of the well-being of our economy. And if we study these social indicators closely, we will be able to get a sense of how our economy is performing, and also we can put the necessary measures in place in order to fast-track development in our communities, to make sure that people have access to basic facilities and developed infrastructure as well. But also we can encourage the projects that happen within our communities because we have social entrepreneurs, people that have identified a gap in the market, not with the intention of making a profit, but because they want to improve the lives of ordinary members of their community. So social indicators are very important. So what are social indicators? So let's start off by defining what they are, and then we will look at application thereafter. So social indicators are concerned with people, okay, because we are looking at the social environment. So they monitor identical or identifiable and definable issues related to human well-being over a period of time. So they are very people-focused and they monitor different issues amongst the community that are related to the well-being of the community over a period of time. So hence it is important that we study these different social indicators because they will give us an indication of the needs of our people in terms of development and the infrastructure that they need for their survival. So we will spend a bit of time in this lesson just going over these. So before we go into them, before we start by looking at the demographics, let's take a short break and then I will catch you right after this.